If we're building the Pelicans version of Mount Rushmore, the conversation starts with Chris Paul. But I'll tell you why it actually took me a minute to feel that way. It's Monday's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday. We got 5 shows this week coming to y'all, and I'm excited for something we're actually going to talk about in the second segment, but also not actually talk about, and that's the relocation stuff. I'm going to get into that in the next segment. There's a reason why. I'll explain. This is going to be kind of a weirder segment. You're going to want to stay tuned to that if you're kind of curious my take on it, but I'm not actually going to talk about it. Yeah, I know that's weird, and I'm deliberately burying the lead of the show in the second segment for a specific reason. But I want to lead off with something that we talked about last week, which was building the Pelicans Mount Rushmore and Chris Paul, and why the conversation starts there. But also, I had a moment of doubt about that, and I'll tell you what that is in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. So we're going to build Pelicans Mount Rushmore this week. We're going to put 4 heads up there of the foundation of, I don't really know what you would call Mount Rushmore to the US, but a monument to the important beginning people, I think, when it comes to this, who's the pillars, the foundation of the franchise here. And for a team that hasn't had, lots of success, it's actually kind of tough to do, truthfully. Do you put Anthony Davis on there, right? I wouldn't put Zion Williamson on Pelicans Mount Rushmore. I'd pick a role player over him, over someone who, who's not nearly as good as him, just because, when I think about this, I think about, who has been the leader of a great era, has laid some foundational work for the city. But I think this also goes beyond just on-court success. It needs off-court success. But so it makes you just kind of naturally think it should be Chris Paul #1. And look, it should be Chris Paul #1. We don't really need to spend much time debating why, do we? In his 6 years here in New Orleans, he won Rookie of the Year, finished second in MVP voting in 07 and 08, and you could argue he should have won it over Kobe, and it was given to Kobe more as a Lifetime Achievement Award. But that year, 21.1 points per game, 2.7 steals per game, which led the league, 11.6 assists per game, which also led the league, 4 rebounds, got to the line 5 times per game, 85% from the free throw line. He shot 51.6% from 2 that year. He shot 37% from 3 on 3 attempts per game. We weren't kind of in the same 3-point shooting era there. He played 80 games and almost 38 minutes per game. Those are incredible numbers that year. That is easily, in my opinion, one of the best years, if not the best year in franchise history. The next year was even better. He finished 5th in MVP voting, 22.8 points per game, 2.8 steals led the league, 11 assists, right? Those are also ridiculously good numbers, I think. And his run here in New Orleans with playoff success, the deepest they've ever gone, all of that has been incredible, right? Multiple All-NBA awards. He made 3 of them. 3 all-defensive first or second team awards as well, right? Finishing in MVP voting, finishing in Defensive Player of the Year voting. Chris Paul's kind of the GOAT of the franchise. But, with him signing with the Clippers this year, this is something that's going to kind of hurt. He will now, at the end of this season, he will, at the end of the season, have played more years with the Clippers than he did with New Orleans, which kind of feels weird to me. He'll likely finish with more games played as a Clipper than New Orleans. He played 425 games with New Orleans. He's at 409 right now, so very close, with the Clippers before this coming season. If someone's kind of got that edge, in terms of games played, minutes, years with another team, can he be on your franchise's Mount Rushmore? Maybe not for some franchises, but I think for New Orleans, he definitely can be. It's a little weird to kind of think about that where if you were in baseball, right, you got to put a hat on them when they go into Hall of Fame, and you don't do that, with basketball, you don't put a jersey on them. But if you had to pick one jersey, would it be a Hornets jersey or would it be a Clippers jersey? And I think that actually starts to get kind of tough this year when you think about it. But certainly he's the greatest player in franchise history, in my opinion. Then there's also the fact that he's a good human being. He still has a lot of family here in New Orleans and Louisiana. He's someone who was very actively involved in the community, constantly coming back to do his bowling event that raised money for charity, all of that stuff. I don't know if that stuff's still going on, but, he was very, very involved. And I think even when you handle the exit that he had from here, requesting a trade, did it kind of the right way, the proper way, compared to, say, Anthony Davis, right? He just went out and was like, look, it's been a long enough time. We just lost David West the year before. David West feels like he has to be on this too. We'll probably talk about him tomorrow. And, the franchise was basically insolvent. George Shinn had sold them to the league because they couldn't get a buyer and all of that stuff. And it was an absolute mess. And he kind of stuck with the team through that, right? When they were practicing in the Alario Center over in Bayou Signet, they would get booted out of there for the circus. When you talk about it being a dumpster fire and not worthy of being an NBA team, that was the era. This era, which I guess we'll touch on in a minute here, ain't even close to that sort of thing, right? There were just no modern standards there for this team. They were being run worse than a G League team at the time, probably. So to have him kind of go through that and still exit with grace, I think says a lot to me. Question of trade, they traded him to the Lakers, and then that got no trade because of David Stern. And as the league owned the team, he was technically acting as owner, not commissioner, but clearly conflict. It's a mess, right? But he handled that well, right? He was traded, then he showed up to training camp, he reported, and he spoke to the media after that, right? And I think that says a lot about him, as a person, when you see a lot of these players skip out on media availability and things like that because they just don't want to deal with it. Chris Paul was always willing to kind of answer and just be a stand-up person and, truthfully do the right thing. And I think that's important when we kind of factor in his legacy here in New Orleans. And that's kind of what we're talking about. I should have used that word earlier, and I don't know why it just dawned on me when we talk about Mount Rushmore of legacy and, who has the 4 best legacies here in New Orleans. And to me, that is a more all-encompassing phrase, word, statement, right, than just what was your on-court performance or what are you capable of doing. And I think Chris Paul kind of embodies everything, right? He was legit, he was referred to as the point god, not the point guard here. That dude's highlights and some of the things he did for this team, leading it to the best, years the franchise has ever had, is truly something incredible. And what a fun, unbelievable player to watch and root for. He's in there. It took me a second thinking about the Clipper stuff. And then, frankly, I got over it because I was overthinking it. And that isn't a reason to not put him on the Mount Rushmore here. So he is definitely the first face that I would etch in stone when it comes to Pelicans Mount Rushmore. Is he number 1 for you? Let's focus on that. He's certainly going to be on everybody's Mount Rushmore, I feel like. And I think he's definitely representative of that best era in franchise history. And I think you kind of got to lead with what you would call the golden years, right? Even if it wasn't all that long and was dismantled by a very cheap owner at the time. So he's number 1 for me. Is he number 1 for you? Where would you rank him in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4? Where does he fall? To me, he's number 1, and I don't think it's much of a debate or much of a question. So coming up next, let's talk about Bill Simmons and some of the relocation stuff and why we're not actually going to talk about it on the show. That confusing? I'll explain. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by 5-Hour Energy Transfusion. It's time to fuel up and turn it up with 5-Hour Energy Transfusion. It brings the bold grape, ginger, and lime flavors of your favorite golf drink, minus the alcohol, into a quick, energizing shot. So whether you're sinking birdies or just making memories with friends, this one's a hole-in-one for your energy game. I actually golf very often. I am terrible, though I birdied the 15th, or not birdied, I eagled the 15th hole at Audubon. Golf's a whole lot easier when you don't have to putt and you just chip in from 30, 40 yards out, which is pretty cool. I got to try doing that more. But it's so hot in New Orleans. I play at like 6 a.m. tee times. And so when I get up, in the 4 o'clock hour to kind of do all that, or 5 a.m., I don't have time to stop and get coffee. I don't even want to spend time making coffee because I want to value those extra minutes of sleep I can get. I just need to get up and drink something. And that gives me energy. 5-hour energy transfusion gives me the energy I need. Tastes great. So golf is all about good times with good people and good flavors, of course. So the grape, ginger, lime flavor gives you the best part of your clubhouse without having to chase down the beverage cart. So if you go to 5hourenergy.com today, that's the number 5hourenergy.com. You can use promo code LOCKEDONGOLF to receive 20% off your order. This promo is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders, so whether you're meeting up with friends or trying to turn 18 holes into 36, get the energizing boost you need to power through. Order transfusion-flavored 5-Hour Energy shots today. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And look, build your Mount Rushmore. Give it to me in order, 1, 2, 3, 4. But let's start with Chris Paul. Where do you put him? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. For your second listen, Locked On NBA. There is no off season in the association, so Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So there is some stuff going around that people have asked me to address, and look, frankly, I'm not going to address it. Bill Simmons on whatever podcast it is, talking with Zach Lowe, threw some stuff out there about, maybe the Pelicans relocate and get sold and move to Seattle. I'm not going to go into this because, look, whether he has sources or not, this is conjecture here, right? He's not putting really anything on the record other than just trying to say it. And is he actually reporting, or is he just trying to kind of stir the pot, right? And look, maybe there's truth to this. Maybe there isn't. It doesn't matter here because until it gets more factual reporting, this is conjecture. And certain conjecture, I think, is fine, right? I want to get very transparent and honest with y'all here that, we talk trade rumors that may or may not come through because, look, those are fun and they impact on-court stuff, but relocation has a much greater impact here, right? People working for the team here, they may relocate, are now probably in fear of losing their jobs and things like that. So I don't particularly want to spend much time giving this oxygen and letting this fire burn more because this actually does have some harmful consequences in some capacity. And I don't think that type of conjecture, rumor spreading, whatever, is actually correct. Look, NBA players are used to getting traded. It's part and parcel of being an NBA player and something you have to deal with. So we will talk about that kind of thing. But hundreds of people potentially losing jobs, whatever it might be, that's not okay, in my opinion. And I don't particularly like that. And that's why I don't want to spend much time on this. Look, if multiple people come out and say this and it starts to be talked about much more with actual reporting and sourcing and be like, there is a buyer here who it is, here's who it is and all that stuff. That's an entirely different conversation that I'm willing to have and talk about on the show. But just made up stuff, no, I'm not going to come on here and just flame Bill Simmons or anything like that. I don't really like to do much of that because frankly, it doesn't matter. And again, it gives people a lot of times the attention that they want. So I'm not going to come up here and do any of it, right? I'm not going to come over and explain why these things are coming up. There's also, even in the stuff he said on that, just very infactual. It's there's not a lot of Pelicans fans that really care or anything. Look, I got a whole channel here that can fill up the arena that tells you otherwise, that people listen to. Locked On Pelicans regularly ranks in the top 8 of our Locked On shows here on our NBA channel when this is the second smallest market in the NBA. Look, truly, Locked On Pelicans has no business ranking that high. This show punches well above its weight. And that's not because of me. Look, I don't think I'm bad at this job, but it's more because of you, the fans, and the passion that you have. And we've proven that there is an absolute ton of passion and that people would very much care if the team moved. So I'm not going to do something if you're just going to come in with that kind of attitude, like, I'm not going to spend time with it, right? Right now, we're not talking about the relocation rumors. We're talking about the relocation rumors or something like that. And so that's what I think is kind of worth mentioning here. Look, if you're going to go by the reporting, right, and sometimes you do just have to take people at their word, the Pelicans have put out statements and things like that, right? Jeff Duncan of NOLA.com, Lee Zurich, I forget what channel he's with, they have put out that kind of reporting on what it is and, what the plan is for the team and succession with Gail Benson, who doesn't have any heirs where these would naturally go to, right? Dennis Lauscha, Mickey Loomis, Greg Bensel, and kind of all of her lieutenants have said what the plan is, right? It's laid out. There's been deep reporting on that sort of thing. So to just ignore that for rumors, I don't think is the correct approach to take when it comes to talking about that stuff, right? That reporting flies in the face of these kind of, I'm not saying they're made up. Like, I'm not even going that far with it. It just doesn't matter to me because there's nothing factual based around it right now when we do have factual stuff out there that basically just says the opposite. And so it's better to build that stuff up, in my opinion, than not mention it, right? Or focus on the negative here. Why don't I just talk about that some more? And we've done shows based on that, right? Look, the arena is an issue. And I have long said, I said this last week when we talked about the arena, the reason for an arena is not just to get a fancy new arena that generates revenue or anything like that. It's because the lease ends in 2029 and you need to figure that out because the lease is what keeps you here. Look, you can have someone come in and buy the team and want to relocate it, but if you've got a 30, 40, 50-year lease at that building, then good luck. Like, that costs more money than you realize to get out of that kind of lease. And if you're already spending billions to buy a team, do you actually have billions more? There's a reason that most of these groups buying the teams right now are like consortiums where you've got to get multiple people with money because it's so freaking expensive, right? If you spend $4 or $5 billion buying a team, do you have another $5 billion laying around to pay for, all the relocation costs, but beyond that, just breaking the lease? I don't know, right? And that can be something that prevents the team from getting moved, or you can just enforce the lease, and it's as simple as that. So the new arena leads to a new lease, or a renovated Smoothie King Center leads to a new lease. When people talk about the arena, it's usually more like, well, it's just old and not up to date. I don't care about that, right? If the NBA wants to let them sign a lease in the Smoothie King Center, as is, do it. I don't think the NBA is going to be okay with something like that and is going to start flexing their muscle on this type of situation. So that's why the arena matters. And I think that gets lost in some of the stuff that's been out there about the arena of a new arena is the key to a long-term lease for New Orleans, which thus then means you don't need to worry about, when the team gets sold, and the team will get sold eventually. Hopefully not anytime soon, but it will be eventually. And so that is why this is so important. The arena has less to do with the fancy features and a jumbotron and a sound system and, the t-shirt cannons like in the Intuit Dome, the Clippers' new arena. That stuff's cool. Like, don't get me wrong. I'd like to see all of that. Like, I very much want to go to the Intuit Dome to go see a game. It looks incredible to me, and I'd like to have that experience there. And I want people to have a similar experience in New Orleans with it. But to me, the bigger thing is, making sure the team stays. So do something with the arena to get a new lease. Everything else with the arena can come later. That's why this, and there's reporting on all of this. None of this is new. None of this hasn't been talked about ad nauseum when it comes to this. So we don't need to focus on the clickbaity negative kind of things, or you could just focus on the facts, which I think, some people don't want to do that. So that's why I'm not going to talk about it. It's why I'm not going to flame Bill Simmons or anything like that here on the show. I'm just not going to do that because I don't want to give it the oxygen any more than I'm kind of already doing. Like, the segment makes me feel like skeezy anyway, and I don't like that. So that's why I am kind of talking about it, but also not talking about relocation, because we're going to focus on the other things. I'd rather talk about trades. I'd rather talk about growth for the players or how to avoid injuries and all of that stuff, because frankly, that stuff's much more relevant, especially now, than just conjectures. If there's more reporting, if there's more concrete stuff to relocation, then we'll have that discussion. But I don't want to worry people for no reason. at all. And that's where I think like these type of rumors are near borderline irresponsible, in my opinion. So coming up next, injuries. In terms of projections, there's something that made me think today, and I'll tell you what that is. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you are listening Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. For your second listen, as Tyler Shook doing in the QB battle at Saints training camp. We also had a fight the other day, which is kind of fun. I love the chippiness. Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints is making sense of everything black and gold. He is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make Ross Jackson and Locked On Saints your second listen today. So people are very down on New Orleans, right? Like, don't like a lot of the moves that Joe Dumars has made. And look, it's the offseason. You give grades on it, and the grades have been bad, all that stuff. Who knows, right? Like, the projections can be so off on these sorts of things, like, constantly. Maybe they'll be bad. Maybe they'll be good. I couldn't tell you just yet. I think they're like a play-in team kind of at best right now, 6th seed at best right now. But one of the things that I do think factors into this is, they've been kind of doubling down on building around Zion. And look, they should be doing that. That's what you do here. That's why David Griffin did it. That's why Joe Dumars is doing it. Had they hired anyone, and if that guy was keeping Zion because they couldn't trade him or because they wanted to keep him, of course you're going to kind of double down and do all of this stuff. So they're doing the right thing. So if you're going to keep building around Zion, you're going to deal with injuries potentially, right? So one of the things that we're doing here at Locked On our NBA, all of our NBA shows, we have, lots of hosts and all the shows and everything is we're doing a survey where we want to do our like top 100. The NFL side did the top 100 players of 2025. So we're going to do the same thing for the NBA side of things, and it's an interesting exercise of like, how do you rank certain things and what criteria do you put in here? And one of the things is they sent the email out today, of like, by the way, go and do this thing, we're voting for next season only with injury concerns included. So if Kyrie Irving is going to be out until February, March, you need to include that in your ranking as the example that they used. So when you're looking at players and where they should rank and all of that, look, Zion's going to be lower because of the injuries. When he's healthy and playing at his best, is he a top 10, 15 player? Probably. But the injuries kind of prevent that sort of thing. When you look at, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, right? I know we're going to get NBA 2K ratings if we haven't gotten those already soon. Look, they've dealt with injuries a bunch, right? Even Trey Murphy has, in a way that, we hope he's going to be better. He looks like he's going to be working out, but he played 53 games last year, 57 the year before that. He hasn't, the past 2 years he's been dealing with injuries. Herb Jones played 30 something games for the Pelicans last year, whatever. Maybe it was less than that. I can't even remember right now where he kind of fell in all of this. Let me pull all that up and actually look, because now I'm kind of curious. He played, 20 games last year. And there have been some concerns of, is he going to be healthy to start the year? Now, Derek Queen might not be ready to start the year, right? So when you look at some of these projections that are going to be coming and you think guys are low, that injury stuff is going to matter, right? Like, would you put, if you're factoring in for next season with injuries included, would you even put DeJounte Murray in the top 100? Probably not. I think you would put Zion, Trey, and Herb in there, maybe Jordan Poole, but you're certainly not going to put Murray in there because, we don't know when he's going to play. And if he's going to come back, in January at the earliest, and then he's going to be on a minutes restriction, well, what's that going to look like and how impactful is he going to be as a player? And does that then kind of impact the rankings, the ratings, and all of that? And it will, and it should. And so when you see people really down on the Pelicans, there is inherently going to be some injury concern baked in to those rankings, those ratings, whatever it might be. I saw some power rankings where it's like, yeah, maybe they have a good team on paper, but what are they going to do when Zion gets injured? When Zion starts missing games, I think is what it said. I think it was over at The Athletic. And like, that's the phrase, when Zion starts missing games. They just assume it's going to happen. It's kind of baked into this. The Pelicans were very low on their power rankings because of this, because of that very reason. So keep that in mind when you're looking at kind of projections, prognostications about the Pelicans, that is going to be a big part of it as well. So that's where a lot of the pessimism around the team is coming from. But should they stay healthy, there's no reason to think that they will. Especially if we're not hearing changes being made or whatever, and all that stuff will come in time if there are going to be any changes. And I think eventually there will be. That stuff the injuries are what's holding this team back more than anything, right? Like we wouldn't even be having Bill Simmons talk like this if Zion was healthy for the majority of his tenure here, right? If he had been playing in postseason games, there wouldn't be any sort of relocation talk then, right? It comes down to your success, and the Pelicans have been hampered from success by injuries more so than anything else. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So tomorrow we'll look at another face on Pelicans Mount Rushmore. I kind of want to keep going through that. We'll talk more about like the top 100. That's going to kind of be a recurring theme here for a little bit that I think is a fun exercise, getting all of our hosts being able to kind of do all of that, and some other stuff coming this week here on Locked On Pelicans. We got a lot to talk about. Let me know what you think about Chris Paul, where you're ranking Chris Paul in all of this. And as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.